Hey folks, if we could, if you could all turn your attention here, how are we doing on the live stream? Are we streaming? Okay, great. Okay. So welcome back, everybody. Thanks to the generosity of the Russell Sage Foundation and the Sloan Foundation and Duke University, it's my pleasure and my honor to introduce Jim Wilson, who's a program officer at the Russell Sage Foundation. And I'll say a few things about Jim, but I think one of the most important ones is that we all probably wouldn't be here without him. Jim was one of the first people who introduced Matt and I many years ago, or not so many years ago, and has been central in leading the Russell Sage Foundation initiative around computational social science, meaning that he's read a ton of proposals, a ton of letters of inquiry, which is a kind of preliminary stage where scholars express interest in a subject. And he's also been a faculty member at Fordham University before spending the last 10 years, I think it is, at Russell Sage. So we're gonna hear quite a bit about how to get funding, or kind of maybe not how to, but do's and don'ts, some very practical advice. And I was just discussing earlier with Jim about how rare this type of talk is. I really wish, before I wrote my first grant application, that I had a talk like this, because we simply don't talk about the process, what goes into it, what are the stages of a grant, how much money can you ask for, what types of things can you ask for. Many of you are not yet writing grants, but many of you may soon find yourself writing grants or participating in grant writing with faculty. So we're really lucky to have Jim here. His talk is going to focus mostly on funding within Russell Sage and kind of foundation-based funding. So these are philanthropic organizations like Russell Sage. And if people have questions about federal funding, say from the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes of Health, we're going to suggest that we bring those up in the Q&A. And then Jim has some experience getting federal funding, as do Matt and I. And so we're hoping that we can try to answer questions about that. One short caveat, with some apologies to our international audience, most of our experience is going to be US based. I think a lot of the principles will translate, but not all of them. And so we do apologize for that. We'll do our best to discuss any implications of for international scholars working in other funding settings. So if you would just join me in welcoming Jim Wilson, let's give him a big round of applause.
Thank you all very much. I want to thank Chris and Matt for having me here today. I also appreciate the fact that Sloan partnered with us in sponsoring the Summer Institute this year, as well as the partner institutes, and Duke for hosting us here. One quick thing, I do play by economist rules, which means that you can ask me questions at any time during this discussion. A couple of things about me. I think you should know who's talking to you. I have something of a checkered career history. I started my life out as a well site consulting geologist. I spent nearly a decade in the oil industry. I went back to graduate school. I spent some time at a research institute in Lower Manhattan before moving on to Fordham University as an assistant professor. And then during my tenure year, the year before I was going up for tenure, I decided I should polish up my CV and send it out and see if I was going to get any bites, just to be sure. And the opportunity to join Russell Sage arose, and I jumped from a tenure-track faculty job to a foundation job. And I have to say, it was a really good decision. I love my position at Russell Sage. It's been a great experience. So if any of you ever want to talk about foundation work, I'm also happy to talk about that as well. Today I'm going to talk about sort of the grant process. It's a lot easier to award grants than it is to write grant proposals. I can tell you that. I have some experience with both. The grant writing process, getting grants and seeking grants, is an increasingly competitive process. I'll also tell you that there are a number of foundations that focus on research in various forms. So I give this talk, this is a version of a talk that I give with several colleagues from other private foundations that focus on funding basic social science research. And so what I have to say doesn't just apply to the Russell Sage Foundation, but at least some sort of a small scope applies to other foundations as well who are focused on funding social research. So what does Russell Sage do? Margaret Olivia Sage was the spouse of Russell Sage, who was a robber baron in the 19th century. When he passed away, she gave his money away to a variety of social causes. One of those was the Russell Sage Foundation. She provided the endowment. In her letter of gifts, she says that it's for the improvement of social and living conditions in the U.S. We focus on the U.S. Most of our research is directly based in the U.S. So the letter of gift also specified that it could be through a broad set of activities, including research, publication, education, et cetera, so forth. During the early part of the century, we focused on providing affordable housing, labor reform, working in poverty. Sometime around 1945, the trustees of the foundation switched the mission to focusing on social research. We are the principal American foundation devoted exclusively to basic research in the social sciences. That's what we fund. We don't fund much policy research. We don't do any advocacy, basic social science research. A little bit of context. We are a small to medium foundation by asset size. If you take a look, if you can compare to Gates, have $40 billion, Ford, $12 billion, RWJF, approximately $10 billion in assets. Our $300 million in assets pales in comparison. Our annual operating budget, about $12 million. We give external project awards each year of about $6 million. The rest of it goes to our visiting scholar classes, which I'll talk about shortly. In comparison to our $6 million last year, Ford gave away $535 million. Now, the other thing about this is that there's a 2014 report. I did a lot of digging for this to see how much funding goes to the social sciences from private foundations, and this is the best I could come up with. A 2014 report from the Foundation Center says that approximately 1% of all private foundation spending goes to the social sciences. So we play a fairly significant role in terms of what we fund in the social sciences. A little bit about how we spend our money. Almost all of our work is through investigator-initiated project awards. We allow the investigators to propose to us within our program areas, which I'll get to in just a minute, any projects that are related to what we do in our core program areas. We award money up to about $175,000 for each project. We have some smaller grants up to about $50,000. Our small awards competitions with big data. I don't know if you are familiar with Sean Reardon at Stanford and the Stanford Education Data Archive. Sean spent a lot of time putting together the data archive. It encompasses about 10 years statewide, state-level data on education. They have made that data available through the data archive, and we fund small grants to investigators looking to work with that data and match it with other data to answer questions of interest to us. Raj Chetty and Nate Hendren have also made their equality of opportunity data available to us. We fund the projects, small awards, to graduate students and early career scholars to work with that data as well. Our Visiting Scholar Fellowships is a program where we bring in approximately 16 to 17 scholars into the foundation each year. We have about 16 apartments on New York's Upper East Side where the foundation is located, about a block away. Those scholars come in, we provide them with an office for the year, we provide them with an apartment, all the resources that they need to carry out a project that they have proposed to us for their year in residency. Typically, most people looking for a year to spend a sabbatical year find the foundation a great place to be. We also have a small visiting researchers, and we've just recently started a visiting journalist program. We have started our own peer-reviewed open access journal. Historically, we did a lot of edited volumes. We found that people don't really read edited volumes any longer, and that peer-reviewed articles are probably much better for early career scholars than an edited volume to begin with. And then we have working groups and special initiatives, and I'll talk a little bit about the special initiatives shortly. I should also mention at this time that we don't really fund a lot of graduate student work. Typically, we're looking to fund full professors. It's the small awards competitions with big data where we tend to fund graduate students. We're looking to expand those small awards programs, but that's in the works. I don't know how soon that might actually occur. Questions? So the foundation has 4 core programs. One in behavioral economics, which has been around since 1986. The Future of Work program, which has been around since 1994. The Race, Ethnicity, and Immigration program was established in 2015, but it combined 2 pre-existing programs that had been around since the early 90s as well. And our Social Inequality program, which has been around since 2000. One of the things that you can take from that is that when we invest in a particular area, we're there for the long term. We don't switch programs very often, and we're looking to build a body of research and knowledge in those particular areas. We also have a set of special, you can take a look at our website if you want fuller descriptions of those, or we can talk about it in Q&A if you want a little more. In terms of special initiatives, we launch these occasionally when we see new areas that are particularly promising or topics that have a lot of interest. For example, I currently oversee the Integrating Biology and Social Science Knowledge program, as well as this program in computational social science. The Integrating Biology and Social Science Knowledge program took about 5 years to develop. It was about the same with the computational social science program. Chris and I were talking about that just a few minutes ago. We've been at this about 5 years now. To give you an idea, with the biology and social science program, there was a long-held belief that anything having to do with biology meant fixed and immutable. But we now know, based on the evidence coming out of the biological sciences, that environment can have a real impact on biology. We know that the environment you grow up in can affect your development, physical and emotional, neural development. We know that it can affect your stress response system. We know that it can impact your genes through epigenetic changes, dictating gene expression. So when we pulled this program together, we were hoping that by incorporating biological measures, theories, and concepts, we might improve our understanding of environmental influences. This program has been about around the same length of time as computational social science. In most of these special initiatives, we try and partner with other foundations. The Immigrant and Integration with Carnegie, Non-Standard Employment with Kellogg, the Socioeconomic and Political Effects of the ACA with RWJF, with Social, Economic, and Political Effects of the ACA. When the ACA originally was established, we knew that there were expected to be health effects. Would more people have insurance? Would people be healthier? One of the questions for us at the foundation is would there be other effects as well, not tied to health? So for example, if a parent had insurance all of a sudden, would that affect children's academic performance because they didn't miss school as much, they had fewer health problems, et cetera? You can see that we are engaged in a bunch of different activities. We've long had a book publishing program. We've started the RSF Journal of the Social Sciences. We have visiting fellowships. The Visiting Scholars program is our preeminent program. We have Margaret and Olivia Sage Scholars. We also bring journalists into the foundation each year. The idea is that many journalists could benefit from the social science knowledge. And I don't know if you've ever read an academic article, but many academics could benefit from the clarity that journalists might bring to them in terms of presenting their work. We're not always so good at that. The Computational Social Science Summer Institute is one of 5 summer institutes that we're running right now. Our Summer Institute in Behavioral Economics has been around for about 30 years. Most of these other summer institutes are at least somewhat modeled on it. The Summer Institute in Behavioral Economics was established in the early 1990s or late 1980s, when behavioral economics really didn't exist except in the mind of Dick Thaler and Danny Kahneman. Economists didn't really recognize it at that point in time. And I would like to think that if you look at most practicing behavioral economists today, many of them actually went through our Summer Institute. And I think there's a general agreement that that Summer Institute helped move the field forward. That would be the hope with the Summer Institute in Computational Social Science, along with our Summer Institutes, is that this is an opportunity to help move the field forward. I was thinking about this yesterday. I didn't get a chance to say what excited me about this when everyone was doing their introductions yesterday. So I'm sorry I didn't get to say that, but I am going to say it today. It's really exciting to me to bring together people from such a broad variety of disciplines. We do this a lot in establishing the Summer Institute in establishing our Computational Social Science Initiative. We spent several years bringing people together from different disciplines across the spectrum. Data scientists, network scientists, sociologists, economists, to help us think about what the potential for an initiative in computational science might involve. And the real problem there, the real difficulty, is getting people on the same page, especially when they come from such a wide variety of disciplines. Matt and Chris have the task of trying to do that in 2 weeks with this group, but I think it should be a really interesting experience for all of you. I hope that you'll find it enjoyable. So, we are a private foundation. How does that compare to getting funding from a private foundation? How does that differ from other granting agencies? The big issue that I typically see is that we are focused on specific programs and funding priorities. If you go to our website, I've already told you, we have programs in these 4 core program areas. We only fund research in those 4 core program areas. So when we establish a special initiative like this one in computational social science, we think about it broadly, but when we think about funding, a proposal under that CSS initiative is going to have to address one of our 4 core program areas to receive funding from the foundation. We typically have more limited resources. That's part of the reason why we really target our funding. I've already showed you what our assets are, about $300 million. And there's generally little interaction between the foundation program staff and applicants. When I was applying for federal funding, I worked with the program staff at NIJ, for example, to really sort of shape the proposal to help take into consideration what they thought as well. As a program director at the Russell Sage Foundation, I don't work with investigators to help shape their proposals. I will talk to them about guidance in terms of the kinds of questions that we're interested in, but it's up to the investigator to propose the project that they're interested in. We do provide reviewer feedback, but that's about it. We don't really work with the investigators in any other way to shape the direction of their project. So, project proposals. some basic guidelines. What we look for are really new and original ideas in the areas in which we're focused on. One of the questions that we ask reviewers to comment on is, what are the questions really compelling, and are they really going to advance the field? So we look for the reviewers to tell us something about that. You have to have a sound and detailed research plan. If you're in the formative stages of developing a project, we're probably much less interested at that stage. With our limited resources, we really like to focus on analysis and writing. We do fund some data collection, but it's really focused on projects that are pretty much fully developed already. It's not the situation where you can apply to us and say, we'd like to develop an instrument because we simply don't support that kind of work. Typically, we like to see some sort of a pilot study or proof of concept. If you have preliminary findings, it really helps your application a lot. That's probably true across the spectrum. If you can show that the project that you're proposing has feasibility, it's always a good thing to include. And then some clarity concerning the interpretation of findings, that you actually know what your project is going to tell you early on. So one of the things that I tell people is that you really should check our website. We are, in my humble opinion, one of the most transparent foundations out there. I don't know if you have a lot of experience researching foundation funding, but everything that you need to know about submitting a grant application to the Russell Sage Foundation is on our website. We have a long list of FAQs developed over many years from people asking us questions. We tell you about eligibility criteria. We tell you specifically the kinds of projects that we're interested in, the kinds of questions that we're interested in addressing, nearly everything that you might need to know. So those guidelines are on the website. The FAQs, I just told you. Submitting on time is always a good thing. We do have people submit late and don't really understand why we can't process their application. We have a budget template on our website that very clearly spells out the kinds of things that we fund, the kinds of things that we don't, or the kinds of things that we don't support in a budget. We also very clearly state that we have a cap of $175,000 with indirect costs. So if you were to send us a budget of $300,000, it would be clear to us that you probably didn't really read our website or pay attention to the budget template that we provided for you. I've already talked about preliminary results. If you have those, it's always good to include them in any sort of project proposal that you send. In terms of data collection, you should already have a draft instrument in place. You should include power analyses, and you should already have IRB approval if needed. The data analysis part, we do provide funding for data access if needed. You should already have that in place. We have a limit if you don't have data access on a project within 180 days of the time you start, or the time an award is made, then we revoke the award until you do have data access. You should include sample sizes, power calculations. I'll talk more about the other kinds of things you'd have shortly. If requested, you should respond thoughtfully to reviewer comments. If we ask you to respond to reviewer comments, it's because the reviewers were largely positive. But I'll talk more about that in just a moment. You should provide very detailed responses.
I have a question about the budget. So, you mentioned that there are certain things that you will fund and won't fund, and so for people who haven't put together a budget before, maybe you could talk about some of the things that go in each of those categories.
So we provide 15% indirect costs. on most line items in a budget. We provide summer salary support for principal investigators up to $25,000 over a 2-year period. We provide research assistance funds. We like to spend money on people doing the work. That includes both graduate research assistants, undergraduate research assistants, postdocs. We provide money for data access for people trying to get to restricted data sets that charge. Census RDCs often have fees that you have to pay as well. That's the most common example I can think of. So we do provide funds for that. We no longer provide funds for travel. Most universities cover that for faculty members. We do provide funds for, we don't provide a lot of funds for equipment. We typically assume investigators will have access to all the equipment, software, anything like that they may need, although we do make exceptions in some very limited cases. I think most of the funds we provide largely go to PI and research assistance as well as data access fees. In some cases, we do support data collection depending on the study. So when you're writing a proposal, well, let's start with the LOI. So at Russell Sage, it's a sort of a 2-stage process. Maybe it's more than that. We require that you submit a letter of inquiry for any project that you're going to propose to the foundation. It's a 4-page letter of inquiry in which you describe the project that you're going to carry out. And then if you're invited to submit a full proposal, that comes at a little bit later stage. But your target audience at Russell Sage, we use external reviewers as well as standing advisory committees to review our proposals. These are interdisciplinary experts in each research area, the programs and special initiatives. In our social inequality program, which I'm affiliated with, we have a sociologist, an economist, a psychologist, I'm forgetting one, political scientist, and a public policy expert on our standing advisory committee. This is true of literally every standing advisory committee. All 4 of our core program areas have a standing advisory committee, and all of our special initiatives have standing advisory committees with disciplinary expertise in the area in which we're talking about. We primarily use active academics. In some cases, I'm more familiar with using practitioners. We do occasionally bring other funders on, especially if we are collaborating with them on a special initiative or a project. And all of them have expertise in the area in which they're reviewing. The RSF review process, which can be a little bit daunting. So as I told you, we do require a letter of inquiry. The way this works is we just passed a deadline, and this is what I was doing about a week and a half ago, was reviewing letters of inquiry.
So 2 questions from the live stream, one from Chicago. Since the computational social science CFP indicates that it will fund research on RSF's core programs, how is that different than the regular programs? And is there a willingness to fund wider topic areas such as political polarization in the computational social science program?
So first question, how is that different? It's primarily different in the kinds of data and methods that we consider. We sort of allocate those proposals that are using data and methods under this area specifically to that program, or that special initiative rather. But all of the proposals that we consider could just as easily go under one of our core program areas. One of the key things is that we're more willing to look at projects that might be a little riskier because they're using the new data or methods. So when you link big data sets, for example, sometimes the linking works well and sometimes it doesn't link well. I'm sure Matt and Chris know more about that than I do. But we're more likely to fund projects like that under our computational social science initiative. We had never really considered data projects that use social media, websites really, until we established this initiative, so that's one of the main differences. I'm sorry, the second question?
Is a willingness to fund wider topic areas. So I think that means like beyond the core programs through the computational social science program.
We're going to stay really targeted on our core program areas in considering all proposals, even under these special initiatives. It's going to be questions that really address issues of concern under our core program areas.
Mentioned when in your discussion that you will fund basic research but not policy or advocacy, and I was wondering with topics like healthcare or with migration, how do you make the distinction in practice when you read the proposals?
I don't know. How do I answer that question? So I guess the question is, what would you consider policy research? How does that differ? Is that the question? How does it differ from basic social science research? I was talking with someone earlier today that we don't consider policy considerations when we're evaluating proposals. We really look at whether the core questions are dealing with issues of concern under our program areas. Whether we can attach a direct policy connect to it or not is some ways irrelevant. We just don't pay attention to those issues. I think of it as we're providing the basic empirical evidence for which others can make policy determinations. That at least in my view is what we do, is we're providing the basic empirical evidence, and that's what we strive to do. If others can make those policy connections using that empirical evidence, that's what we would aspire to, but we don't do that. So we require a letter of inquiry. It's a four-page letter to the foundation that is going to lay out the project that you're proposing. A couple of things about the letter of inquiry. It goes through an internal screen in the foundation first, which means that at least 3 of our program staff read the letter of inquiry. If it gets through the internal screen, then we'll send it out for external review. What we are primarily screening for is fit with the foundation's funding priorities. And we're also looking for any issues with the LOI as it was submitted. So for example, I at one time had some degree of expertise in a specific area. I am more of a generalist now. But if I can read your letter of inquiry and I can spot methodological problems, I can guarantee you that our external reviewers are going to spot those same problems. So when I'm reading a letter of inquiry, what I'm looking for is fit to the foundation or any methodological or design problems in terms of what you're presenting to me. If it passes that internal screen, as I said, we send it out for external review. We do send the letter of inquiries out for external review. We send it out, we pick 3 reviewers and send it to them. When those reviews come back, provided that those reviews are largely positive, we will invite a full proposal. With the full proposal, when those come back in, they should have addressed any issues that were cited in the initial reviews of the letter of inquiry. We send those proposals back to the same original reviewers, the first 3 that saw it the first time around, and we add one or two more. So typically, by the time it gets to the proposal stage, it will the LOI would have been evaluated by at least 3 program staff. The LOI would have been evaluated by 3 reviewers, and then the proposal gets read by an additional 4 to 5 reviewers. And then once it comes back, we compile all the proposals, all of the reviews, and if we invite investigators to respond to reviewer comments, we include those and we send them to our standing advisory committees. Our standing advisory committees are the people who are tasked with assessing the proposals, the reviews, and the responses to decide whether or not they will go forward to our Board of Trustees for funding consideration. Once it gets to our Board of Trustees, it's not an automatic approval. We have a very active board. They read the proposals closely, and they will occasionally decline to fund one, sometimes 2. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. And again, all of this progress through this chain is conditional on positive reviews throughout the process. So, go ahead.
Questions from the live stream. So Sarah from Chicago asks, can junior faculty join the panel of external reviewers, and how? So for example, now to offer informed expertise in computational social science. And a second question is if you're allowed to basically bid for funding for open access publishing costs.
No to the second question. For the open access publishing costs, we don't support that. To the first question, we rely on our networks for decisions about who to invite to join our advisory committees. So we've been working in this area since 1945, as I said. We have more than 30 or 35 years of visiting scholar classes and hundreds upon hundreds of grantees, and we typically rely on those networks when we're looking to replace social advisory committee members. So we go out and try and find the individuals that it will all depend on the kind of expertise we're looking for when someone rolls off one of the committees. I don't know if any of you have ever submitted anything for review. But if you have gotten something back from review before, you know that the comments that you get can kind of be all over the place. Sometimes you get conflicting information. One reviewer likes something about your project that another reviewer hated. They're telling you to do different things. And they can really go sort of off track sometimes. The peer review process, both good and bad. I found that extremely frustrating when I was doing research. So we ask reviewers to comment specifically on the following 5 things. We send them these questions and we say, this is what we want to know. The first thing we ask them is, does the project address an important and compelling question or a set of questions? And is the question framed appropriately in terms of prior theory and empirical work? I will go into a little bit more detail in some of this in just a minute. So to prelude what I'm going to say in a little bit, the question is where we start. It's really the beginning and the end of the proposal. The next thing we ask the reviewers has to do with the research design and the data and the methods. Will the design and the data and the methods that you're proposing help you answer the question that you're posing? Do the qualifications of the investigators suggest the capacity to carry out the work? Do you need to bring on additional expertise? We also want to know what the likely contribution of the project is. Is it going to move the field just a little tiny bit? Are you going to answer a small question? Or do your findings have the potential to really sort of answer some of the bigger questions? And then we just ask them to add any additional comments that they might have. But typically what we really get are answers to the first 4. As I said, everything starts and ends with the question. The very first thing we ask about, are the questions important and compelling, and are they a fit for the foundation's funding priorities? As I've already said, we do very targeted funding, even within our core program areas. Are the questions clearly stated and identified? I can't tell you how many times I've read LOIs or proposals, and I get to the end and I still don't know what the question is. That can either be because it hasn't been very clearly stated, or it's been stated several different times in several different ways without a clear conceptualization of what the question is. It's one of the things I tell people first. When you're drafting an LOI, it should follow a very, very clear structure. And I'll talk about this now really quickly. When drafting an LOI, the most common mistake I see, beyond the fact that it's not clear what the question is that people will spend 3 of their 4 pages with a literature review and then 1 page telling me about the data and the methods. Your LOI in 4 pages should be balanced. It should tell me on the first page what the problem is and what the main questions are. It should probably maybe take another half a page. It should then lay out in as much detail as you can lay out in 2.5 pages why your data are appropriate to answer the questions, why they're better than other data. So it's not just that why your data can answer the question, but why aren't you using other data if those are better? You should explain the significance of that. And you should convince me that your methods are going to help you answer the question as well. I've already told you that you need an interdisciplinary understanding of work. You should not just read in your own discipline. For virtually anything I can think of these days, somebody in other disciplines are doing work on some of the same questions. And I'll give you an example. I think I just talked to someone about this in the meetings. We had a proposal a number of years ago from a team that was proposing to do some work along the lines of child development and later life outcomes. When we sent the proposal out, it got stellar reviews back until we got the reviews back from the developmental psychologists. And the comment from the developmental psychologist was, this was a really great project if it had been done 20 years ago. Their conceptions of child development are out of date by 20 years. This is one of the reasons why we use interdisciplinary review panels. It's important to know from a variety of disciplines the work and the knowledge that's been produced across these variety of disciplines. It's also important, and I think it's also important why you should read broadly, not just within your own discipline. The data and methods, as I said, sure.
In terms of determining whether or not a question qualifies as important and compelling, could you elaborate a little bit on sort of the thinking about the sort of theoretical importance vis-a-vis policy implications? I mean, ideally, a project speaks to both, but I was wondering if there were sort of a preference in emphasizing one or the other.
So, if I understand your question, because we fund basic social science research and we don't focus on quite as much on policy, we're really going to be thinking about prior theory and what that's telling you about the questions and the kinds of answers that you can get. So once you've established the questions, then the question becomes, can you answer those questions in the project that you're proposing to carry out? So everything else in your proposal should be dedicated towards saying why the data and methods that you're proposing can help you answer the questions that you're posing. You want to overview the research design, the techniques, the data. You want to explain the key independent and dependent measures. Again, I can't tell you how many proposals I read that don't really tell me what those are. They'll just lay out a big list of variables. And then again, why are the data that you're proposing to use the best available? This number 3 point, I think, is especially appropriate here. Powerful new data or methods can't make up for uninteresting or irrelevant questions. And in the same sense, important and compelling questions can't be satisfactorily answered with weak data. It has to be a combination of both. You really have to have interesting questions that we like to see, and you have to have data and methods that are fairly strong. The other thing I'll mention here without too much fanfare is that when you're writing a proposal, you have to be very careful about the language you're using. If you are using causal language, you need to have a causal design, because reviewers will pick you apart for it. I will pick you apart for it. If you're writing a descriptive project, don't use causal language. It's really important. Writing grant applications is not easy. You should think about it in terms of what it takes to write a manuscript. You have to put a lot of time and care into it to make sure it's right. So you want to be clear, crisp, avoid jargon at all costs. I don't care what your discipline is, whatever the jargon is in your discipline, and we all have jargon in each of our disciplines, avoid it like the plague. As I've already said, take an interdisciplinary perspective. You want to clearly state the key questions and hypotheses. I've already talked about that. You want to make sure that I know what your questions are. You also want to make sure how you think they relate to RSF interests. That's true of other foundations as well. When you're submitting a proposal to a foundation, make sure you're indicating why the questions that you're asking are relevant to their interests. As I said, we ask investigators when we get reviews back to sometimes respond to reviewer comments. I would think that this wouldn't need to be stated, but clearly I was wrong. If you're ever asked to write a response to reviewer comments, you should not imply in any way that the reviewers are stupid or do not understand the complexity of your thinking. That's tip number 1, because the reviewers will not take kindly to it. If you're writing a response, be detailed, make your case about what you can and cannot do. Sometimes reviewers will ask you for things that are just completely outrageous. You just have to explain why you can't do the project that the reviewers want you to do instead of the project that you're proposing. As I've said, our website contains everything you need to know about applying to the foundation. We have program descriptions, funding announcements and deadlines. We have a long list of frequently asked questions. I can tell you that we have an email address that you can send questions to on our website. The people who answer that email says that 99.9% of the questions can be answered by visiting the website. There's something like 0.1% that requires a response from a program staff person. We have a budget guidelines. We have a link to our application portal. We have all the information about our publications for our Journal of the Social Sciences. You can sign up for our newsletter. It comes out once a month, tells you about new funding announcements, new work that we're publishing, nearly everything that you need to know. So some concluding thoughts here. When writing an LOI or a proposal, the thing that you should ask yourself when you're drafting a LOI or a proposal is, have I included everything in this that I would need to see if I was a reviewer? What else should you be thinking about? Have you included all of the information? Relevant power analyses, the detail on the data. What would you need to know as a reviewer to adequately assess that proposal? Receiving a grant from RSF is somewhat equivalent to publishing in a Tier 1 journal. We fund about, depending on the program area, about 4 to 5% of all LOIs that come our way. The next thing and the last thing is that grant writing is really hard. I told Chris earlier that my first grant proposal was really awful. It was sort of an abomination. You don't get it right the first time. Well, most of us don't get it right the first time. If you submit a letter, not only to RSF, but to any other foundation, you should not assume that if it gets rejected, that we'll never fund anything that you are interested in doing. Talk to anybody who's submitted grant proposals, and they will tell you it's sometimes a hit and miss process. You should always, if you think you've got an idea that's relevant to a particular foundation that you have in mind, you shouldn't hesitate, even if you've been turned down before, to pitch it again. I have seen proposals come back, some from investigators, sometimes the same proposal that they resubmitted, sometimes with new proposals get funded second or third time around. If you do get feedback, take it to heart, think about it. Are the reviewers indicating something that you can build on? Are they giving you good information? And the last one here is especially useful, I think. We get a lot of proposals that simply are not in any way, shape, or form aligned with our interests. Maybe Chris or Matt can talk about NSF, but if you've got a project in mind and you're just throwing it against the wall to see if it sticks, that is not a viable grant writing strategy, at least not with the foundations I'm familiar with. We have very clearly defined target areas and programs. Anything that doesn't fall within those target areas, our core programs, we're just not likely to consider. There have been, I could probably count the number of cases on one hand over the last 10 years that I've been at the foundation where I can think that we've funded non-program submissions. And typically those are because they're posing really interesting questions in new areas that we think we might want to go down. Our website is chock full of information. You can email me personally, or you can email our programs at our SAGE email. One of our staff people typically check it every day. I'm happy to talk to any of you at any point in time about anything that you have in mind. If you want feedback, if you have questions, feel free to get in touch with me. And finally, just in case you thought this was a complete waste of time, some people charge $395 for grant writing workshops. I think I'm done. Questions?
Question from Chicago. Could you talk about what kind of priorities and interests underlie the behavioral economics funding area?
I am not as familiar with the behavioral economics program because I don't work with it directly, so I hesitate to answer that. I mean, I think that it's pretty well spelled out on our website, and I would say you should visit our website to take a look. There's been some discussion around the behavioral economics program. It's our longest standing program, and one of the questions is whether we need to rethink it a little bit, and that's part of the reason why I'm hesitant about answering questions about it right at the moment. But everything that's current is on the website. No other questions?
I'll ask some questions that many people might not know yet to ask. So I guess like one thing, given that many of our students are not yet, maybe they're being funded by other people, or they, they don't yet, have a sense of what things cost. I mean, if we could get a general sense, maybe bring Matt in or Jim, what are the reasons why people might want grants? Typically it's not just funding a survey. It's something like funding a graduate student, which Russell Sage doesn't do, or for example, getting a course buyout, which would allow you to take some time off teaching to develop a new research project. And we haven't yet talked about, say, overhead or the processes through which universities make contracts with. These are all in your future if you are faculty. Some of them are more exciting than others. But I just want to encourage everyone to think down the road, 2 or 3 years if you're in graduate school, maybe 4 or 5 years. And imagine yourself, now you want to fund a graduate student, or you'd like to hire a postdoc, or you'd like to run a survey that's, say, going to cost, $10,000, $15,000. There's very few places where you can, out of pocket kind of pay for those things. And so grant writing becomes a really, really critical skill. So I would encourage you to think, tomorrow, if you were charged with writing a grant, Jim's given us such a great overview of the process, but think through what you would need to know, what you might like to learn while he's with us here. Matt looks like.
I have a question for Jim that I think Chris's question raised that I think is important for people to keep in mind. What would you say is the average time from when the grant is submitted to the time that the money arrives? Because as you're planning your research, assuming everything goes well, as you're planning your research, I think a challenge is you often have multiple projects going at the same time, and there is a large amount of planning ahead that has to happen because of the time lag. So could you talk a little bit about the timing?
So for us, and I'm going to think in terms of the timeline we're on right now for our November board meeting. We had a May 24th deadline for letters of inquiry. We turned those LOIs around internally about 2 weeks. They went out for review, I don't know, I've lost track of time, a few weeks ago. So from May 24th, we would issue invitations for proposals by early July sometime. Those proposals will be due in mid-August, give or take a few days, the 15th or the 20th, I forget exactly which. The review process, once the proposals come in, takes about 4 weeks. And we will make decisions on those at our November board meeting. So crank the numbers for me. How many months is that, from May to November?
So that's fast, I would say. It's about 6 months, roughly.
That's about
Yeah.
right.
And
then it depends on the funding request itself. So it takes us about 6 months to make a decision about funding or not. And then after that, it depends on when you ask for the money. So given that sort of a time frame, people may ask for it as early as December. Some people don't ask for it until the following summer, but in anticipation of the work they're planning to do.
Just one thing to put that number into context, I would say with federal funding, the time lag is usually longer.
Yeah, my experience with federal funding was not positive. It was about 14 months.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I just had a question. Does your foundation has ever funded research outside the United States or comparative research, or is the United States the only place to formulate social science?
So, as I said, we're largely focused on US-centric research, right? There are some, I'll call them minor caveats to that. So we have funded some comparative research, but it really has to make a strong case that we'll learn something about the U.S. The other case in which we funded research outside the U.S. is we have, in some rare cases, funded research using non-U.S. data. And the example that I can give you of that, but it's under very special conditions. So we funded a project several years ago using, I want to say it was Swedish register data. I don't know, do you know the register data in the Norwegian countries? Yes? I mean, it tells you, I mean, it's nearly everything you would want to know. We funded a project. It was a US investigator who had a partner working with, I forget what the organization is in Sweden that has access to Swedish register data. Working with the research there, they had access to the register data. And what they wanted to do, I just described this to somebody in my meetings earlier, what they wanted to do was look at the impact of lottery winnings on family and child outcomes. So you had Swedish register data, you had, I don't know, is that a quasi-experimental design? I mean, lottery winnings are pretty random, right? And so the impact of lottery winnings on family outcomes. So did an influx of cash improve academic performance for kids, et cetera, so forth. So in that case, we had data that was not available in the US, and we had a design that was fairly strong and a question that has plagued US researchers for a very, 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 very long time. So it was sort of like a perfect storm of questions. And you can reasonably make an argument that whatever findings that came out of that could probably apply to the US as well. You and
Can you hear me? So you mentioned that you don't normally fund equipment. What about wearable technology? Because I can think of a couple of very successful projects in Europe that involved giving out, for example, radio devices at conferences and tracking the behavior of people, or giving out smartphones to college students. Do you cover that kind of equipment?
The answer is we deal with those things on a case-by-case basis. If the question is interesting enough and you don't have funds from anywhere else, we might. Typically, we assume that people have access to equipment, but now you're talking a really specific situation that we haven't encountered. I hesitate to say no, because it depends on the project and the questions and how central this, I mean, in this case, you're talking about wearable technology, how central that would be to the data collection. And it's possible. It's not something I would consider totally out of the question. Again, it's a case-by-case basis depending on the project and how important it is to us.
Oh, thanks again. I was going to ask actually more about the data section that you had brought up, saying that it's important to have sample size calculations and instrument design. I was wondering if you could talk about, for computational social science, the data sources are a little different. So do you apply a special set of standards?
Well, there are some cases in which you don't do power calculations, right? Most qualitative research doesn't come with power calculations. We do ask that you have, I think the main thing is that we do ask that you have a really strong idea about your research design before you apply to us. If you don't have it well formulated yet, you probably can't explain it to us well enough that we're going to fund it. If you know what that research design looks like, then you know what you need to indicate to us to substantiate the design. If that involves power calculations, if that involves qualitative research and what you might need to talk about in terms of whatever those things are, you should have a well-formulated plan before you apply. you should be pretty well entrenched and know what you need to provide. Other questions?
I have a question. So you talked about the importance of having pilot results and sort of proof of concept, but often it's difficult to have proof of concept or pilot results without having a lot of resources to begin with. So could you talk a little bit about maybe how you've seen people successfully manage that challenge?
It is difficult. Some people are able to sort of carry out the initial work just in the course of their everyday research lives. It's difficult. We have a small grants program it's called a Presidential Awards Program of up to $50,000 to carry out proof of concept studies or pilot projects that people can apply for. So if you're thinking about the early stages of a project like that, you can often apply for those smaller awards. And I know that that's also true of some other private foundations that fund research as well. They have these smaller award programs to help you sort of provide seed money that will get you off the ground and moving forward. Other than that, I mean, universities will often have, probably slush funds is not the right term to use. I don't know what the universities have that they have like these little faculty research grants that, and sometimes they have a lot of money to help provide faculty funds to sort of get them off the ground and going. It depends on the university.
Thank you. I was wondering, you mentioned that that you were mostly interested in projects that are already very well developed, and on the other end, there are projects that are a bit more risky. So I was wondering how to combine those two elements, because is then the risk being borne by the researcher, and you can then select from those that are already a little bit successful. So I'm just curious what it looks like, those two elements in a project.
Risk versus a well-developed project. So I think, as I indicated earlier, we really have limited resources, and so we really like to target those funds at the later stages of a project. So that's why one of the reasons why I said we really like to fund the analysis and writing stage once the data's been collected. Data costs, as you know, can be prohibitively expensive sometimes. Although, as we've talked about here today, some of the data that you can get through these new methods and from new sites, it might be a little easier, but data costs can be prohibitively expensive. Risky projects, it's one of the reasons why we really want pilot studies. I don't know how to weigh the balance between those two. In some cases, we have seen highly risky projects that we really like a lot, but because of sample sizes, we thought they could easily be misinterpreted. And we have requested investigators to seek additional funds and then come back to us if they can supplement the funds that they're requesting from us. And in most cases, that happens, where we're willing to fund the project, riskier projects, depending on what the potential risk is. In that case, we don't want to fund research that can lead to misinterpretations or misunderstandings. And typically that's, if you're trying to draw conclusions off too small of sample sizes, that can be problematic. That's usually the case where we've encountered questions. Yeah. I don't know, do you want to talk about federal funding or alternatives, NSF funding briefly?
Maybe just briefly, we could just give a super brief overview of how the federal process might differ a little bit from the foundation process. And again, with apologies to our international audience, I don't have any experience with international science foundations. Typically, federal funding is tied to citizenship. So as Americans, it's hard for us to get funding from the European Science Foundation. I'm sure there are some joint initiatives, especially in our area, such as the Digging into Data initiative, which link the European Science Foundations to the National Science Foundation. Maybe I'll talk about NSF, you could talk about NIH. Okay, so I'm both a former grantee of NSF, and I also sit on the advisory council to the National Science Foundation's Social, Behavioral, and Economic Sciences Directorate. So I can tell you a little bit about the organization of the foundation and how it might differ a little bit. So, okay, let's see. The first thing I would say, the first significant difference is that this is taxpayer-funded research. And so that means that the NSF, the National Science Foundation, has to be funded through an act of Congress. It has to actually, people have to vote to fund the NSF at different levels. And so there are, negotiations about whether or not taxpayers should support something, right? So currently in the NSF, we're facing a lot of pushback around research that's perceived as unimportant or frivolous. And a lot of the earlier questions were about the policy relevance of the work. And many federal sources also focus on basic research. And I think maybe it's useful to clarify what we mean by basic research. That means research for research's sake. So, even if the answer doesn't have some broad relevance, we still want to know the answer, right? And NSF will fund that research, but NSF also has a criterion that when you write up your proposal, in addition to many of the same elements that Jim described, though you don't write a letter of inquiry, you typically submit a proposal, and the proposal is much more involved. It involves a lot more paperwork, a lot more, you need help. And so most universities will have something called some type of grant office. Some of them are very large, so at Duke, we have dozens of grant administrators, and typically as a faculty member, you would approach one of those people well in advance of the deadline, because it's actually a very involved process to submit a grant. Again, there's lots of loopholes that have to be jumped through. And then you would write something like the project description that Jim described. So you wouldn't write a letter of inquiry. You wouldn't have to do that first screening phase. And then, but you would have to include the same kind of budget items that Jim described. And one big difference would be, again, this concept of overhead. So federal grants typically pay some amount of money to your university for basically, you could think of it like to keep the lights on. So for example, many top universities, such as Harvard or a place like Duke or Princeton, if you win a $100,000 grant, for example, as much as say 60% of that could go to this thing called overhead. Okay, so instantly your $100,000 grant becomes $40,000. Bummer, right? Okay, and now on top of that, let's say you want to fund a graduate student for a year. And though you as a graduate student may receive $20,000 or $25,000 a year after taxes, the faculty member also has to pay for your health care and for your tuition very often. And so the cost of one graduate student could be well over $40,000. So a $100,000 grant could maybe only fund one graduate student. And a postdoc, you can do the math, but if a postdoc's got a $60,000 salary and then needs, and then you're paying for healthcare and then, anything else, instantly, you could be looking at $200,000, right? And that's without paying a cent for any of the costs of data collection. Typically speaking, at NSF, the grants are much smaller in the social sciences than other corners of NSF. So NSF also has a computer science and engineering program, and then it has specific disciplinary specific programs like sociology, economics, political science. And And the process is a little bit different, the review process. So proposals come in and everything gets reviewed. So there's no initial screening process. A panel of experts is typically convened typically about 10 to 12 people. They divide up the proposals in groups according to their expertise. They read them. External reviewers who aren't convened as part of the panel will also come along and read the proposals, or not come along, they're recruited to evaluate the proposals, and they send comments. Then everybody goes to typically Washington, D.C., and there's a discussion about each and every proposal for a grueling 2, sometimes 3 days, and every proposal is ranked. And then a recommendation is made about which proposals are of fundable quality. And then there's a negotiation process between the staff of the National Science Foundation and program officers who have Jim's role. Very often they're either current or former faculty members, just like Jim, and their job is essentially to advocate for things to be funded. And then there's a decision made at a higher level about how much should be funded, and that's partly based upon how much money Congress gives to allocate money to grants. And then if and when that comes through, then money is finally, and the grant is judged as competitive, then the money gets transferred after, this many rounds of review by many people. And it's very often the case, and I don't know how, I'd be curious to know how often this is the case with Russell Sage, but you can really kind of receive something tantamount to a revise and resubmit decision on a grant. So if you get, let's say your first grant, I remember my first grant I put in was also not great, but it was probably okay because I got comments back that said, this is a problem, and this is a problem, and this is a problem. And I looked at it, and I was then a junior faculty member, and I said, oh, well, I guess I'm not getting this grant. And then I was having lunch with a senior faculty member a few days later, and he said, oh, how'd that NSF grant go? And I was like, oh, I didn't get it, and they said there was a bunch of problems. And he said, well, let me see it. And he read it, and he said, this is an R&R. You need to fix these things and resubmit it. And sure enough, the next, thankfully he said that, and now as a reviewer and on the council, I've seen this unfold a lot. So the problem with these federal sources, and NIH, as I think Matt will tell you, each one has its own complex system, which is why these staff that you would work with at your university are so important. They can be very Byzantine, so whereas NSF will have panels, NIH will have study groups, and so on and so forth. So it's a whole new thing you have to learn. It's not my favorite part of my job, but it's also kind of an essential skill to learn, and there's very few opportunities to learn about it, like Jim has provided us with here. But that's a very short tidbit of how NSF works, and maybe I'll hand it over now to Matt.
Sure. So I've received some funding from the NIH before, and I'm very grateful for that. In terms of similarities and differences to NSF, I think one difference is that the NIH grants are usually larger in the social sciences. I think one piece of advice that I received that was incredibly helpful was to look at prior grants that were successful. And so when I wrote my first grant, I wrote it, and then I asked a colleague who had a successful NIH grant if she would share it with me. She did. I looked at it, and they looked totally different. And I thought, wait a minute, I've followed all the rules on the website, and the NIH has a lot of rules on the website. And so I showed it to my colleague, and I said, look, here's what I've got. It looks really different than yours. And she was like, oh, yeah, you didn't follow all the unwritten rules. And I was like, oh, thanks. Knowing those unwritten rules is a very difficult part of the process. And for that, I think having more experienced colleagues is incredibly helpful. If you can talk to the program officers, sometimes they can help you with the unwritten rules. They are really trying to write everything down. As you can see, the Russell Sage Foundation has a very complicated website. The NIH has a very, very complicated website. But there are certain things about style and tone that are very hard to write down. And there's really no replacement for having someone who's navigated that process successfully help you through that. The other general piece of advice that I received that I think is really helpful is to actually review some grants. So someday you may get an email from Jim asking you to take a look at an LOI or a grant. And you may be very busy, but it's probably a good idea to do it. One, it's a nice service to the community. And second, it will give you a sense of what the experience is like on the other side of the process. And I think having some understanding of what that's like for the reviewer and having some empathy for the reviewer and the difficulty of the task that they are facing and trying to look at what you're doing and understand it. You obviously, as you're writing it, you have so much in your head and you know this is such a great idea. And then it passes through this like straw and goes to the reviewer, and they have to like see through that tiny window and try to decide whether something that may not have even been really started yet is going to be successful or not. And so spending some time on the other side of that, I think, can help you communicate your ideas more clearly to your future reviewers. So that's a little bit about NSF and NIH. Another source of funding in computational social science is from companies. This is a different process in many ways. It's often less transparent. It's often faster. In some ways, it's often easier. The proposals are usually very short. There's not a lot of grant infrastructure. Often, it will just come as a gift to your university that's earmarked to you. So I know Chris has received funding from
Small Google and Amazon, but small.
Google and Amazon. I've received some funding from Google and Facebook. In those situations, I think having relationships with people who are at those companies makes an enormous difference. I think many of the companies have websites that you can apply to. I don't know of anyone who has applied without knowing someone at the company who has gotten one. I'm not saying it has not happened, but I think whereas NIH, you can absolutely apply to NIH and not talk to the program officer and have your proposal funded, I think that would be much less likely at one of the tech companies.
I can just add a little bit more in the landscape of foundation funding, and Jim, please chime in here because I'm sure you know more about some of these foundations than I do. But Russell Sage is really unique in funding basic research. Some of the earlier questions about like policy relevance and impact. Private foundations, right? These are really philanthropies. So many of them do care. Their main issue is creating impact in the world. Gates Foundation, Carnegie, they want to create impact, especially outside the U.S. Others really want to, move the needle on education, say Ford Foundation or Spencer Foundation, and they will, fund a blend of both more pure research, but also they would appreciate a part of your grant perhaps that has a public dissemination component. Likewise, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the third or fourth largest funder on your list, very, very concerned with actually having impact in the world, actually improving public health. And it's part of their mission, right? And so though we might like to say, that they would all fund what we like to do or that they would all like to fund our favorite area, we really are to some degree at the mercy of funders and what their priorities are. And they, people on the boards of these foundations do that work, just like the advisory council at NSF has conversations about broadly what areas should NSF be funding in. And the one good piece of news, and I mentioned this in the first day, is that there's just a lot of interest in a lot of places. So the Ford Foundation has a big initiative now around reducing unequal access to digital technology. Sloan Foundation has been funding that kind of research for a long time. Carnegie Foundation is really interested in social media research. Now the question is like, how do you find out about this? How do you can visit their websites, You can learn a little bit that way, but also you should know that many universities have kind of a grant liaison person whose job it is to kind of help you understand the grant making landscape. And so if or when you find yourself in a junior faculty position, you should reach out to this person and say, hey, I'd like to do research on X, can you help me brainstorm funders? And the other piece of advice, and I really want to echo Matt's advice on getting someone else's grant to follow off of, is look at other people's CVs who have done the type of research that you'd like to do and see where they got money. Know, of course, that foundations will change their priorities over time, so they may not still have the same program. But if you start to see that, if you're in, there was a question about funding political polarization. Well, go look at the researchers in political polarization and see where they're getting money. And that's typically, the process I think a lot of people follow. But yeah, there's a lot of different ways to get money. Some are much more straightforward, some are much more involved. The immediate reason to get this money is to be able to do your research. But depending on your field, it can also have an impact on your career. So for example, if you're a demographer, or if you're in public health, for example, when you were going up for tenure, there are places where people might ask, well, what's their grant record? Have they gotten grants yet, right? And it could be, in some cases, a critical, condition of getting tenure. In other fields, if you were in, say, cultural sociology or something like that, there would be much less, people might still be impressed by the prestige of getting, would you say your rate is 5% or something like that? Might be very well impressed by that, but it wouldn't be seen as an essential component of your tenure case. So to figure that out, you'd have to talk to senior scholars in their field, look at their career trajectories and so on. But grant writing can be important on multiple fronts, and also because as you progress through your career, you may find that the projects you want to take on are increasingly ambitious and require multiple people, require more your time, which will become increasingly precious as you go on to teach more, to do more administrative work. And so the reason that many people navigate the Byzantine labyrinth that is NIH or NSF is in order to is in order to get these kind of course buyouts, which buy you time, which can be a really precious good when you are a busy junior faculty member. One final thought in terms of learning, you might want to, just like you might want to get someone else's grant application, if you are working with a faculty member, say as a postdoc or as an advanced graduate student, you might learn something by helping out on that grant. I learned quite a bit by doing that over the years, helping faculty I was working with as a graduate student. And that's another way to learn the kind of tricks of the trade, especially these unwritten rules that Matt was talking about before. Okay, anything else? Okay, well, let's please thank Jim and just for a great talk, and thanks for bringing us all together too, above all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.